Greetings, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you are. I took a poll yesterday about what you as the listener would like to hear, and it was a mixture of everything, so this is going to be a compilation video. Stories will include truckers, cryptids, ghosts, deep woods, let's not meet, etc., etc. These stories are also in no particular order. So, it is time to go back to ashes. For when we arise from the ashes, we are a bigger, brighter, and stronger person in the morning. Sit back, relax, or tuck in and get warm. And let's get started with these true, scary stories. My brother was a truck driver in the 90s, early 2000s. He just told me this story a few months ago. He was driving through Pennsylvania, on his way back to New Jersey. He pulled over to the side of the road, behind two other trailers. In the early morning, he heard someone bang on his right door. He quickly jumps from the sleeping compartment and grabs his bat. As he looks out the window, there's no one there. But now there's a bang on the left side. Freaked out, he looks out that window, and there's nothing but silence now. He's trying to figure out what the hell is going on. Seconds later, banging on both doors simultaneously. He said the banging was so loud and heavy that the truck was shaking. Both curtains open. He can see there's no one out there. He quickly jumps in the driver's seat and starts the truck. He sees the other two trucks ahead of him do the same thing. He said he felt as if they had experienced the same thing. My boyfriend is a truck driver who routinely does midnight runs. Oddly enough, I asked him this question myself a few days ago. He told me that one night he was getting ready to park in a lot next to a truck stop. He said it looked like there were no lights, no cars, no sign of anyone, but he said screw it, he was tired. He woke up the next morning parked on the side of the road with 3 highway patrol vehicles behind him. He was about 15 miles away from the truck stop he parked at. Thing is, he was sleeping in his camper the whole night. He has no idea how he got on the side of the road, and logic says someone tried stealing the truck and succeeded. And the police convinced him of this happening as they saw a man in a black jumpsuit running away from his truck in a nearby field. Even then, he still feels uneasy about the whole situation. Apparently, the doors were still locked from the inside, and there was no real sign of anyone trying to break in. There is a house in downtown Ventura that is reportedly very haunted. It's a huge old house. My sister met a woman who used to live there. It has 7 bedrooms spread over 4 levels. I'm not sure what the architected type is called, so I'll just describe it as an old wood frame house with an antique ornate style. Picturesque, set on the foothill overlooking downtown and the ocean and the Channel Islands. When I lived in the area, the house was vacant. During my frequent late-night walks, I'd sometimes sneak up the 24 front stairs and peer in the windows or walk around back. Occasionally, I'd bring a date up there to fool around on the porch swing. It was vacant for a long time. My sister told me the house was haunted, and once when she was visiting the house, a floor lamp suddenly slid across the living room, apparently of its own volition. Startled, she looked at her friend, the woman who lived there, and she kind of shrugged and said that things like that occurred frequently. They would often hear noises from the upper floor. There was another tenant who resided up there, and sometimes they would hear noises, like someone talking or walking around, only to find out later that the tenant was not at home. She eventually moved out, and sometime later, I met her and I asked her about the house. She confirmed the lamp story and said that many things happened there and that she moved out because of them. She had hated living there. She said, "Let me show you something." She pulled out her phone and flipped to a photograph of a young man sitting on a sofa in front of a dark picture window, or maybe glass sliding doors. She said that it was her son on the couch. The photo was just kind of a typical random snapshot of a kid sitting on a couch. Also in the photo was a large swirl of white smoke to the right of the kid. It looked like cigarette smoke that had drifted in front of the lens, except when I looked closer, I was startled and frightened by what I noticed about it. There was a very clearly defined face in the smoke. Not a human face, but one of a creature with an elongated muzzle and head shape like a canine. The mouth was open, showing large, sharp, pointy teeth. The eyes were fierce and appeared to be looking into the camera. I truly hate to say this, because I tend to roll my eyes at stories like this, but it is best described as a dragon or demon face. I don't believe in demons. The image was unmistakable and gave me chills and goosebumps. The woman said that she hadn't seen anything when she took the photo, that it was just a casual snapshot of her son while they were sitting and watching television. She managed to get the landlord to reluctantly let her out of the lease after she told him everything that happened there. Eventually, they found tenants. There were old cars and beat-up motorcycles out front, and junk stored on the porches and balconies, so they didn't appear to be neat, clean, orderly tenants, and the house looked in need of repairs and maintenance. I never met the new residents, but I wonder if they had any experiences in that creepy old house. I got a call from my cousin who said that he, his brother, his dad, and his best friend were using a Ouija in their basement. Prior to starting, they took a large porcelain doll out of the room because it was creepy and placed it in an adjacent room face down on a pile of towels. My cousin took a short break because the board was just spouting nonsense, and he went to take a dump. His dad and brother and friend started asking the board questions without him. One of the questions was who was in the other room. It just started spouting random numbers, and when my cousin came back into the room, his brother said that it wasn't working, that they were going to put it away, and he showed him the answer to the last question. He asked and he said, "Dude, that's my social security number." Then, they started to talk to whatever started spewing answers out. It told my cousin he would die in the Air Force. At this point, they tell the entity they are communicating with to prove itself. It then spelled out the word DOLL, and we were all just like, what the F? They opened the door to check on the porcelain doll they had laid in the other room. And when they opened the doll was standing up right in front of the door, staring right at them. Everyone freaked and ran out of the house. His best friend burned the Ouija board, and I think he temporarily went nuts for a few months. My cousin, for some reason, then joined the Air Force and is on a base in Europe at this moment. My dad lives in an apartment, and one day he came home to cops outside of his door. It was very early, 5 or 5:30 a.m. They asked if they could ask him a few questions, and my dad said yes, of course. He invited them in and made them breakfast. They asked him some questions about his neighbor across the hall. Just general stuff like, have you noticed anything weird, etc. My dad told him no. He looks like a well-put-together 30-ish-year-old businessman. My dad lives in higher-end apartments, so this is what everyone looks like. Nothing weird or out of the ordinary. The cops go on to explain that a 30-year-old woman is missing and was last seen by a security camera walking into the building with this man. But they never had any footage of her, or him for that matter, leaving the apartment. The cops stay outside and monitor the apartment until about 5 p.m. that night, when they finally get a warrant. They noticed a shower curtain missing and golf clubs scattered on the bedroom floor. They end up arresting the guy. Fast forward 3 weeks, and the cops find her body about 45 minutes south in the woods on the side of a bike trail. Some runner stumbled upon her. Nothing more was released on what state she was in. Then, about 2 months ago, they found more tapes as the investigators went back to look at them. They discovered the man leaving the apartment with his golf bag. But like I said earlier, all of his clubs were in his room. I'm sure many people have put 2 and 2 together. A full-size woman wouldn't fit in a golf bag, but that's how he got her out. His trial is coming up. As of right now, he claims it was an accident and he panicked and tried to hide it since he had a girlfriend. To preface this, I want to say, last year I spent about 32 days in the woods, either scouting, hunting, or fishing. Literally, in the middle of nowhere. The year before that, I spent about 22 days. This doesn't include my regular hunts and camping adventures, which in the past 3 years adds up to just over 100 days. I've been hunting since I was 9, and have spent a lot of time outdoors in various different parts of the US and in Canada. I've seen and heard a lot of strange shit, and this takes the cake. I was in Cohutta, North Georgia wilderness, for 7 days scouting for bears, wild hogs, and deer, prepping for a hunting trip later that year. I had hiked in about 10 miles, and then went off trail for another 3 to 5 miles. Basically, again, I was out in the middle of nowhere. Since I was alone, I was using a hammock that has a built-in bug net, and I had a rain fly over it. I spent about 3 days halfway up a mountain, just looking for a good place to hunt. I saw 3 to 4 good-sized bears, about 10 hogs, and came across some good-sized deer. On the 4th day, I was going to head down to a small stream that I had marked on my GPS, and then set up camp, restock on water, and prep for the 2-day hike back. I could have gone faster, but wanted to be able to look for any animal sign along the way. As I was approaching this small stream, I noticed a tent, which I was excited to see, as I had been completely alone for a few days, and it's always nice to run into another hiker. Generally, us wilderness folks are pretty down to earth. As I got closer to the tent, I noticed that there was a small pack on the ground just outside of it. I figured the person couldn't have been too far from where the camp was, so I set up my camp about 30 yards away, and with about 4 hours of daylight left, started cooking some dinner. 2 hours later, I was starting to wonder where this person was, given that I was in the wilderness, and it was a 1 or more day hike out. There wasn't much I could do, but I did hike around the site, making a circle as I went out to look for any signs of struggle in case of a bear attack. or maybe they had an injury. I got about 1/4 of a mile from the campsite, walking a circle, but I didn't find anything. As night came, no one showed. I started a fire in hopes that the person would be able to find where they set up and have some light. Fires burn really bright and are very easy to see from far away. After eating, searching, and hoping that the person was going to make it back, I called it a night. I had a small flask with me and took a couple sips of whiskey, jumped into the hammock with my pistol, and attempted to go to sleep. I sleep pretty hard. I mean, really hard, regardless of where I am. It literally annoys my friends because I can always seem to fall asleep and stay asleep, regardless of where in the world we are. But this night was different. I felt like something was off. But I figured it was just me worrying about this person who, by all my accounts, was completely missing. So, for the first time in my life, I woke up to the sound of what I thought was footsteps, but not in the sense of footsteps on leaves, but what a heavy-footed person would make walking on an old wood floor. It was extremely loud. I got my gun, grabbed my headlamp, stored in a small compartment up above me, and waited to see if it would stop. Right at that moment, it did. Then, I saw something that scared the ever-living hell out of me. On my rainfly, the gleam of a flashlight, faint, but there. I shouted, "Hello?" And right when I did, it sounded like 10 people suddenly running away from me in every direction. I dropped out of my hammock onto the ground, frantically turning on my headlamp, shining it all around me. But I didn't see anything. My heart was racing pretty bad, but I thought it might have just been the reflection of the moon on the rainfly. Yeah, that was it. And those footsteps running away from me was probably armadillos or something, even though their eyes shine, and they are pretty easy to spot. Problem was there was no moon. I've never seen an armadillo above 2,000 feet. Not to say they don't live up there, just never seen one. And for some reason, the campsite I set up by was gone. The fire had been put out by water. It was apparent because there was not a damn coal in the thing. I thought for sure it was about 4 a.m., but I had only been asleep about an hour. At this point, I wanted to leave, but hiking out in the wilderness while it's dark is always a bad idea. So, I grabbed my flask, took a swig of whiskey, removed my rainfly so I could see out of my hammock and around the area I was in, and tried my hardest to go back to sleep. I was laying down when I saw some light hit the trees above me. It was clear it was coming from downstream, and I got out of my hammock and started yelling, "Hey, y'all need any help?" No response. I saw whatever was putting out the light, and it spun around and started heading downstream really fast. At this point, my body had pumped through adrenaline, then it had blood, and I was exhausted from it all. I finally was able to fall asleep and woke up around 7 a.m. When I did, I noticed that my water filter I had left out was missing. It's a gravity filter, and it hangs on a tree filtering water down into my main bladder that I put in my backpack, and my water bladder, sitting at the base of a tree. Looked like it was cut down the middle with a knife. They cut down my bear bag, which had food in it, and took some of it. The creepiest part of it all was that they went through my bag, which was under my hammock, while I was still sleeping. I checked the bear bag before I went back to sleep the second time, and it was still there, hanging, and my bag under my hammock hadn't been touched. I packed up all my gear and hightailed it out of there, keeping my pistol close to me and moving as fast as I could. I ended up making the hike back in just 15 hours. I hiked the trail part in the night because I wasn't about to spend another night out there. I didn't see anyone on my hike out. There were no cars parked at the trailhead, and the DNR said they had only seen my car there. Since then, I haven't gone out there without any friends. I reported all this to the local DNR, but they looked at me like I was crazy. I don't know. What do you think? Maybe I am. My dad was a trucker for many years. One time he told me he'd stop at a mandatory way station somewhere at night that was refurbished from an old train station. My dad parked the truck and got out, noticing that someone was walking along the train tracks with a light. It was really late, so my dad called out and asked if he was okay. The man kept walking. My dad said he had a lantern in his hand. My dad called out again, and the man never turned around. He went into the office and told them that some drunk butthole is walking the train tracks, and the guy behind the desk nonchalantly says, "Yeah, was it this guy?" and points to an old-ass picture on the wall. It was a picture of all the rail yard guys from like over 70 years before. Sure enough, my dad had seen one of the guys in the photo. Apparently, a lot of people have seen whatever that was and come in asking questions. So, this glitch I witnessed happened in June 2022 when I was on a work trip. It still bothers me and makes me question it to this day. I work at a private stewardess on board a motor yacht. This job requires me to travel very often, so I spend a lot of time at Atlantis Resort on Paradise Island in the Bahamas. One night when I was off, my crew and I decided to go to the beach that is part of the Atlantis Resort. Only people staying at the hotel or marina can access it. It was myself and two of my other crewmates who decided to go. Our boat was docked in the marina village, part of the resort, but the beach was about a 20-minute power walk through the hotel and casino, and breezeways outside. So, we left the boat, and the first place we had to walk through was the casino. Mind you, there are a lot of stairs to climb. Just to get into it, probably about 50, and many other stairs throughout the walk. These two crewmates are good friends of mine, and we're always talking and making jokes with each other. We talked pretty much the entire walk. As we're walking through the casino, I noticed a lady maybe in her mid-30s standing near a machine, with a stroller digging through her purse looking for something. She stood out to me because I really liked the athletic dress and gym shoes she was wearing. Although I usually like a lot of people's outfits, so it wasn't a weird thing for me to notice. I didn't feel the need to point her out to my crewmates because they were both guys and wouldn't appreciate her outfit as much as I did. The three of us continued walking at a swift pace through the casino, the lobby, and the outside breezeways paths, many random stairs. Eventually, after a solid 15 minutes of walking, we approached the kids' arcade and daycare center. And as we walked past it, I was shook. The woman in the athletic dress and stroller was in front of us, waiting in line at the daycare, as if she had been standing there for a bit. In my mind, I thought there is no way she could have gotten there before we did. There's just no possible way. There are way too many stairs for her to have done by herself, especially with a stroller and a small child in it. What gets me is that it seemed as if she was standing there waiting for a bit. I thought about when we walked past her in the casino, She was rummaging through her purse looking for a phone or something and had no intentions of leaving right after we passed. I didn't say anything to my crewmates when we walked past her because I was making sure it was definitely her. As soon as we walked past, one of the crew goes, "Is it just me or was she in the casino when we left?" I couldn't be happier when he said that because it was my confirmation that I wasn't the only one who witnessed this. He and I both noticed her and thought of the exact same reasonings as to how it would have been impossible for her to have beat us here. It was a really strange coincidence, and I just do not think she could have walked faster than the three of us, especially with a stroller to push and carry up and down the stairs. Since we spend so much time at Atlantis, we were for sure certain that the way we walked is the fastest way to get there. If there were any shortcuts, we would know about them. He and I still talk about how weird that encounter was. The whole time we were at the beach, we were discussing how the only logical explanation was that it had to be a glitch in the Matrix. Anyone else who has experienced this or something very similar? It bothers me so much, and I'm desperately trying to discover the truth. A few years ago, I was on the outs with a very dependent girlfriend. What started out as just casual dating turned into her practically living at my house, needing to constantly be in contact with me, and was always trying to spy on my social media accounts. She was extremely depressed and used my sympathy as a weapon to keep pulling me back whenever one of her crazy actions would push me away. It took my stupid younger self a long time to see the pattern. When I finally did and she realized that she was losing me, she ran over my dog, thinking that the grieving process would bring us back together. The worst part is, it kind of did. The pain of having to drive my dog to the vet and put him down was too much for me to handle on my own, and for once, she was there for me instead of the other way around. Until a few weeks later, when she drunkenly admitted what she had done. I have never been so mad about anything. I was raised never to raise my hand to a woman, but my morals were seriously tested at that point. I couldn't get the trip to the vet to put the little guy down out of my head. How could this person that I loved have done something so psychopathic? I threw all her shit out and had to physically remove her from my house. I filed a restraining order, but before it went through, I had to threaten to press charges just to keep her away. I haven't talked to her since. I feel bad for anyone that gets caught up in her psycho crap. I thought she loved me, but that really led me to wonder if she was some kind of psycho or sociopath who had been playing me for a fool the entire time. Okay, I was 21 and she was 24 and had a boy about 2 years old. She was basically normal, had a good job, took care of the kid. She was kind of a dim bulb though, not very bright. I was bored in the relationship and really didn't want to become stepdad to the kid, so I ended it, no problem. I run into her a month or so later at a bar, and we end up going back to her place for a night of sex. Next morning, she makes coffee and breakfast. I go to school, she goes to work. I get incredibly sick on my way to school. I ended up throwing up multiple times. Made it to school still puking, found the nurse in the medical office, and vaguely recall being loaded into an ambulance. Come to in the hospital. A doc tells me I OD'd on an enormous amount of meth and had about 5 minutes left to live before they figured it out. Oh, by the way, there are some federal agents here to talk to you. Turns out, she had planned this whole thing and decided that if she couldn't have me, no one else could. She went to jail, but got a reduced sentence for turning in the family member that was making and distributing the meth. This is a true and raw experience that I've only reiterated to a few of my closest friends and husband. It is midsummer 2013. I was out with friends about 10 miles from my home at their apartment and stayed up late with them until 2 a.m. It is important to note that I had taken an afternoon nap that day leading up to these events from about 3 to 5 p.m. And we did not do anything other than smoke some weed and drink a little. At the time, being 20, and after having started dabbling at 17, it wasn't anything out of the ordinary to have a few drinks or a few puffs. Basically, I had a hefty tolerance, and I wasn't seeing crap. I was not out of my mind, is what I'm trying to say. In fact, more towards the realm of sober, when the following took place. I left my friend's house after napping on her couch from 2 a.m. to just before 5 a.m. I left her house 15 minutes from mine at just before 5 a.m. I was totally sober and just wanted to get home to my comfort zone. So I drove, sober. My parents owned a home in a lake community, so when I drove in on a back entrance road, it's one of the main. They're all just back entrance in the country. I immediately was stirred in my unusual go-with emotions to a large black and oval shape in the distance over the lake. The road I was on is a hill that connects down to a road that spans the circumference of the lake community. So, as I turned down onto the circular road, I saw this ship, as I describe it, hovering about 100 feet off the lake through the tree line. It's winter in the northeast, so you see everything. As I turned right onto this road, it began following me at speeds along the road as it traveled. My parents' road was a sharp right off it, so I gunned it, going about 60 in a 25, because I felt an immediate feeling of needing to get out of the area. And I remember repeatedly muttering, "I'm going home. This is not happening. You will not take me. I'm going home." In a panic. I just sensed an ominous feeling, and that this was otherworldly. Let me be clear. I've never had an encounter or experience such as this before. I made it home with no issue, but remember, after I repeated that about 3 out of 5 times, the thing disappeared from sight, and I just hauled it to the last 1/4 mile home and raced to my room. I remember looking out my bedroom window, which had a slight view of the lake during the winter, and seeing no evidence of the thing that just essentially chased me. That was the feeling. Ever since, I've had other instances of awareness. No one believes me, but I'm as steadfast in the belief as the sky is blue, grass is green, and personally, unrelated and don't need to be a debate, coexist without that, thanks. God is real. Has this happened to anyone else? So, I was on my way home from Arby's with a mint chocolate shake, zoned out for a sec and almost didn't notice his car. I tried just letting him through, but he insisted I go on ahead. I didn't think much of it and just continued on walking. He drove on ahead and parked his car near some apartments. He had on a black polo shirt, so I assumed he was just dropping something off for a job or whatever. As I kept walking, he approached me and offered me a $20 bill. I asked why, but couldn't understand what he said in response. I refused since I know that's best for me. However, that didn't deter him. He grabbed my waist and I stepped to the side. He then started pulling me towards his car. I bit his hand so he couldn't silence me and made sure to scream as loud as possible to try and attract any bystanders if I could. He managed to get me into his car, and just before he could close it, I stuck my foot through the door to keep it open. I then got out and made myself go limp, since adding dead weight without warning creates sudden resistance and makes it harder for them to grasp you. Due to this quick thinking, I was able to get away unharmed. I quickly booked it and got on the phone with my mom once I was at a safe distance. I made sure to stay on the phone until I got back. After that, I had taken some time to calm down and waited for the cops to get there to get my statement. The officer ended up praising my quick thinking, telling me that I was lucky and done everything right in that situation. Please, everyone, take self-defense seriously. I've only ever had a week-long course, and just that alone had managed to save my life. I didn't remember too much from my self-defense course and only used the basic techniques that I'd remembered, which was making noise, dropping my weight, and checking behind me. Any other actions I'd taken were a result of logic and quick thinking. Chances are, if I'd gotten more self-defense training, it likely wouldn't have been as close of a call as it was. Also, never accept money from strangers. While there are good Samaritans, there's also people who don't have your best interest in mind. If you do think they have good intentions, make sure to double check by asking why they're offering you money. If you don't get a good legitimate reason, then make sure you refuse. If you refuse and they still persist, then get away immediately. To the guy who tried to kidnap me, let's not meet. I had taken a job working for a company based up in the mountains. They offered me a cottage to stay in while working there. It was a hold home built into the side of the mountain and surrounded by forest. I lived in the basement, which had been converted into a small living space with a bathroom, kitchen, sleeping area, and laundry room. The laundry room was L-shaped and had a door that went out the back and into the surrounding forest. The door that led to the forest was locked from the inside and was quite difficult to open. I never used that door and always kept it locked. The rest of the house was empty, but I didn't have access to it. After a day of work, I returned to my little basement for an evening reading and playing solitaire. I turned off my lamp and started to nod off when I heard a noise. The noise was like a wood creaking. I played it off as my imagination, but then it repeated. I thought, maybe one of the cabinets in the kitchen was latched improperly and swung open. I checked, but all the cabinets were secured. I opened my closet, thinking maybe something in there had made the sound, but again, nothing. The last place to look was the laundry room. I opened the door that connected the house to the laundry room and was instantly hit by a gust of cold night air. I slowly turned the corner and witnessed the door that led to the outside just swaying in the nighttime breeze. I don't know what happened. Was there someone in the laundry room just waiting for me to fall asleep before sneaking out? Was it something supernatural? Either way, there are a few times I had ever felt such genuine horror. While backpacking the Appalachian Trail in northern Pennsylvania, a friend and I finished hiking up a very large hill and were ready for lunch. We had planned on eating at a shelter that was another 2 miles down and up another hill. After some discussion, we decided to eat at the shelter as there would be water. Well, as we arrived at the shelter, we come across who we initially think is another hiker. But no, This guy was just carrying an old school backpack and was digging for crumbs out of the bottom of a Frito bag, so he seemed out of place. We asked if he was backpacking or day hiking. Never making eye contact, he mutters out, "Backpacking." We then ask if he was section hiking or through hiking, as in doing the entire trail. He looks at us with this weird look and says, I'm just hiking through." After a little bit of talking and avoiding all of our questions, he just quickly said, "I gotta go." As he packed his bag, we asked what his trail name was so we could look out for him on logbooks. He clearly had no idea what we were talking about. And this struck us as odd because anyone who hikes the Appalachian Trail knows what a trail name is, and usually has one they go by. After sort of explaining what we meant, he said, "Oh right, it's Hatchet," which was obviously a load of crap because the guy was holding a pack axe in his hand when he said this. Well, we continued hiking, and we reached our camping spot. We got settled for the night when I'm woken by Hatchet rustling through my backpack. Now my friend and I both use hammocks, and I had my backpack wrapped around the tree my hammock was on, so he ended up shaking my entire hammock. I screamed, "Hey!" and he looked into my hammock, stared right at me for a good second, then bolted. By the time I got out of my hammock, he was nowhere to be seen. Turned out, he had stolen a pack of tuna from my bag and a couple granola bars from my buddies. We never saw him again. The weird part was we got back into town and ate lunch at a diner. Turns out old Hatchet was on the run. There was a wanted poster hanging up on the door. Turns out 2 weeks prior, he had mugged a couple people, leaving one guy pretty bloody. The whole thing was pretty freaky. We gave our statement to the police, but never heard if they caught him or not. This is an unexplained phenomenon or glitch in the matrix from about 5 years ago. My partner and I took a road trip from Florida to North Carolina and decided to drive straight through. We stopped once or twice for gas, and the car was always monitored by one of us. We had 2 suitcases in the back seat. Mine was on the bottom. When we arrived in North Carolina, we both had the distinct feeling that there was no way 10 hours had passed. We both kept exclaiming that it felt like we went through a time portal, and we were confused at how quick the car ride felt. I remember actually trying to recount the audiobooks we listened to and piece together how it was possible that 10 hours had passed. Well, we arrive at the place we're renting and put our suitcases in the room. While I'm in the shower, I hear my partner exclaiming and freaking out. I get out of the shower to see what it's all about. He's crouching over the suitcase, utterly confused. The zipper is sealed shut with a plastic loop and 2 tiny metal keys. Like the keys that come with a diary or perhaps a tiny lock on a brand new suitcase. There was no way to open the suitcase without breaking the plastic loop. He starts freaking out and asking the people in the house we were renting if they were playing a trick on us. They look at us like we're crazy. Finally, we open the suitcase and all of my stuff is still in it. Okay, first of all, my suitcase was on the bottom of the 2 suitcases. Someone would have had to get into our car while we weren't looking. And like I said, we never really left the car. To put the plastic loop with keys on it. And why would they choose the one on the bottom? And who would do this? This was an old suitcase I had used many times, so it's not like something I just never noticed was there. Second, even if it was sealing the zipper closed, and I had even grabbed a sweater out of my suitcase during the trip. I think we truly experienced a glitch in the matrix. this is all still completely an unexplainable mystery. This happened on a ranch that my brother and I lease in eastern Montana. The ranch in question is massive, covering about 18 sections. A section is 1 square mile, or 640 acres, and is 2/3 deeded, with the rest being either BLM or state-owned. The land is incredibly rugged, being covered in clay hills and deep canyons, and is for the most part unfenced. There are several buffalo jumps on the ranch, where hundreds of years ago, the Indians would chase herds of buffalo off cliffs to their deaths. We can still find buffalo bones at this site. Supposedly, the ranch was also the site of a massacre, where an entire village of Hidasta were killed by their enemies, the Soy, although I haven't found an actual record of that incident. Also on the ranch are 2 abandoned homesteads, the Mint Place and the Carter Place. These are fake names as the families still live in the area, and I would like to keep their information private. The Mint household is merely 1 mile off a country road and relatively easy to access, so my brother and I use the dated cattle pens that are a part of it. The Carter Place is more remote, however, only being accessible on horseback, as the trail that went to it washed out many years ago. All that is left of the Carter Place is a log cabin with the roof caving in, an old coral system, and a barn that has toppled over. The last people that lived in the Carter house was the Carter family themselves, but during the 1930s, the father went crazy and murdered the entire family before turning the gun on himself. At least that's what people said. The ranch's current owners live in California and have owned the ranch since purchasing from the Mint family sometime during the 1980s. My brother and I began leasing the ranch in 2007. There was some unusual activity at first, mainly random lights, but nothing that couldn't be explained in a reasonable way. The strangeness began in 2017, after a well was drilled on the property. I wonder now if this may have unleashed something. During the fall of 2017, I was searching for strays on horseback when I was approached by 2 frantic hunters. These hunters claimed that they were being stalked by a pack of wolves, but I was dismissive, as there had not been a wolf in this area since the 1920s. The hunters claimed that they knew the difference between wolves and coyotes, and were absolutely certain that what was stalking them was wolves. Whatever it was had seriously bothered them. Later in the year, when we were trucking cattle away from the ranch and back to the home place, we found out that we were a dozen heads short. Despite us running 600 cattle on the property, we kept very close tabs on the herd, and it was unusual to lose more than 2. But no matter how many times we searched and recounted, we could not find the missing cattle. This began a trend, and so far since 2017, there have been a total of 138 unaccounted cattle, a financial loss of $165,000. Though there are many odd events that I could recount, there is one that stands out. This took place in October of 2020. Myself, my brother, and my brother's eldest son were gathering the cattle and herding them to the Mint homestead, where they could be loaded on trucks and taken to our home ranch for the winter. By this time, the weird activity on the ranch had increased, so much so that we never went to the ranch without being armed. This day was no exception, and strapped to the saddle under my left leg was a Winchester .30-30 rifle. The morning went well, and by noon we had gathered 200 head, which we pinned up at the Mint place. After eating a quick lunch, my brother and nephew loaded their horses and left. My nephew had a football game later that day. I stayed alone and rode northwest toward the Carter homestead. The first strange thing to happen was when I rode down a canyon. As I was riding, I could hear multiple howls and cries coming from all directions. I cannot describe what these howls sounded like, because they were like nothing I had heard before or since. As I continued riding in the canyon, I was overcome with a feeling of dread. My horse, Ace, seemed to pick up on this as well, and began spooking at almost every shadow. This was very out of character for him, as he was usually a very calm and collected horse. The second strange thing was when I approached the Carter homestead. As I crested a hill in front of it, something jumped out of the old log cabin and ran in the opposite direction. I was still close to a mile away, so I had to use my binoculars to get a better look. What I saw through the lenses chilled me to the bone. It was a wolf, but it was massive and solid black. It was so large that it could be mistaken for a black bear, and it was undeniably canine. After seeing the wolf, my gut told me to turn around and come back later with company, but I ultimately continued. Throughout the course of the afternoon, I managed to convince myself that the wolf I saw was nothing more than a coyote, and that its black fur was just a shadow. It was nearing dusk before I arrived at the mint place, herding 30 head of cattle in front of me. After I pinned the cattle up, I led Ace back to my pickup and horse trailer. From a distance, I could see there was something wrong with the trailer, and as I approached it, I found that the axle had come apart. It didn't make any sense to me as it was fine when I drove in, and there was no explanation as to what could have made it come apart when it wasn't moving. By this time, it was fairly dark outside, and as we were coming out the next day, I decided to unhook the trailer and leave Ace at the corrals overnight. When I left, I saw 3 blue lights near the corrals, but I attributed these lights to hunters, so I continued driving. I also heard some more of the howls I had heard earlier in the day. When all 3 of us arrived the next morning, we found the corrals in a total mess. All the grass was turned up inside the corrals where the cattle had been milling, and the fence was broken in several places. The cattle that were penned up the night before were nowhere to be found, along with Ace. My brother and nephew took off on horseback to try to locate some of the cattle and Ace, but only managed to find around 20 head. As I was without a horse, we repaired the trailer and left later in the afternoon. The next day, all 3 of us rode and we searched exclusively for Ace. During this time, I covered a lot of country that I would have otherwise missed, and I discovered more bizarre things. At the bottom of one canyon were hundreds of holes, about 1 foot in diameter and 3 foot deep. These holes had to have been dug by people, as there would be no animal that could have dug them. I also found a bone pile, which was exceptionally strange. There were the carcasses of 4 cows, all piled on top of each other, in an area that they typically would not have been accessed. At first, I thought that was the act of poachers who were illegally killing and butchering cattle at the ranch. But there would have been no way to get to this location without a pickup or a 4-wheeler for that matter. The more we searched, the less sense everything made. We searched for 3 days before we came across something. My brother radioed me, as there was no cell service, that he believed he had found Ace. My nephew and I rode to his location, and sure enough, at the bottom of a sinkhole. Sinkholes are very common in this area, so its presence was not unusual, was the carcass of Ace, along with 3 cows. The sinkhole was at the bottom of a canyon, with the walls of this canyon being 300 feet tall, the sinkhole being another 20 feet deep. It took an hour just to climb down the canyon walls. When I finally approached the sinkhole, I found Ace to be heavily mutilated. Both ears were removed, along with the eyes, nostrils, and hooves. The back half of him was not exposed, but it looked like his tail was also removed. The cows surrounding him also had similar mutilations. As was the case with the Howells, the wolf, and the trailer, none of this made sense. It would have been almost impossible for just one cow to end up in this location, let alone 3 cows and a horse. There were also no tracks leading into or out of the sinkhole or canyon. The sheriff and veterinarian were both notified, and an investigation was launched. The ultimate conclusion was that something had caused the cattle to spook and break out of the corrals, and whatever it was, spooked them so bad that they ran all the way from the mint place to the bottom of the sinkhole, in which they perished. When I mentioned the wolf I had seen, they were dismissive, just as I had been when the hunters told me of the wolf 3 years prior. No foul play was suspected, and the case was closed. Though there were many strange things that have happened since then, there were none quite as upsetting as the loss of my horse. Cattle continued to go missing, and we now only ride the place in pairs. My brother and I are thinking about terminating the lease, as for the moment, the current cattle losses were unsustainable. For the time being, I can't help but to think that we may actually have a skinwalker on this ranch. I have no evidence, and I do not care if you don't believe me. I've used a board with results and let something into my home, and have been physically assaulted by this entity. It started out with that feeling like you're being watched, and doors closing, and footsteps on the hardwood when you were home alone, and progressed slowly into being kept awake by something shaking the bed or pulling off your covers, sometimes even whispering your name. The board would disappear for days on end, then show up in places you never would have put it. I became obsessed with it. Then it was a black mass in the corner of the room, or the silhouette of a man watching you from the doorway. After that, it escalated pretty quickly. I had my hair pulled, fingers pricked, scratched, choked, held down in bed while this thing whispered in my ear in what could have only been Latin. We had our house blessed, and the bad thing hasn't shown back up. Just the normal occurrences now. But I will never again play with one of those damn Ouija boards. The place we lived at the time, a few years ago, was a house on a gravel dead-end road across from a church. The church had 2 drives, because it had a circle drive that went under an overhang. But there was no drive behind or around the church. None. One way in, one way out. That gravel road dead-ended. I was babysitting the kids I nannied for, and mine were all playing outside in the side yard. No one went around back of the house, because there was poison ivy. So we were always in the front or on the side, always in view of the road. The church's groundskeeper comes down the cross street, turns on the gravel. Dark gray Honda, same car he's driven for years. He smiles, nods, and waves. The church was good neighbors, nice guy. He drove slowly past, through the church's parking lot, to park in front of the garage beyond the church, which is also in view. I wasn't watching him, I was watching the kids. But I was facing the church. All this is in my field of view. I was thinking to myself a few minutes later that he must be working on equipment inside today. He hadn't walked back through the parking lot to the church. Then, I hear tires on gravel. Look up at the cross street again. Here comes the dark gray Honda. I stared at it confused. The church's groundskeeper smiles, nods, and waves just like normal. I whip my head around and there's no car in front of the church's garage. This car goes and parks there like normal. About a minute later, he strolls back along the parking lot checking out the landscaping. I cannot state firmly enough that there was one single way in and out of our goofy little enclave, and that was gravel, and it makes a sound I look up at every time I hear it, reflexively. It was not long enough for him to have come, left, done something, and returned. It was maybe 10 to 15 minutes at most, and he did not leave. I would have seen that, and if I wasn't looking, I would have heard it and looked. Guy came almost daily. Same guy, same car, same smile and wave. He just showed up twice. Bardogger is my guess. Someone explained that concept when I shared this on Facebook. I do believe I just witnessed a glitch in the Matrix. So, a little about myself. I'm 41 years old and currently working as a salesman at a retail outlet that specializes in men's business suits. The job makes pretty good money, but with alimony to my ex-wife and child support on top of that, I seem to just barely get by. I had just finished going through the horror of divorce 6 months before this last incident occurred. I had started drinking again. Drinking and looking longingly at sleeping pill bottles and razor blades. I know what you're thinking, but I've always been too much of a coward for that sort of thing. Though I will admit, it's always seemed tempting, especially after losing everything like I did. Anyway, as you can imagine, I was feeling pretty low for a few weeks, so I was quite pleasantly surprised when this elegant, beautiful woman about my age came into the store and began to show me some interest. She was tall and slim, wearing a charcoal jacket and skirt combo. Her hair discreetly dyed a bronzed amber, and she had a very unassuming smile, not too blemished by laugh lines or crow's feet. I admit, I'd noticed her before she approached me. I spotted her the moment she entered through the door. She seemed kind of familiar, but I wasn't going to tell her that. That's got to be the most obvious non-pickup line in the world, telling a strange woman she looks familiar. Anyway, she walked up to me with this coy smile, just showing a glimpse of perfect white teeth, and said, "You probably think I'm in the wrong store." I gave a little giggle, cleared my throat, and said, I'm sorry? "This is a men's clothing store, obviously," she elaborated. Her eyes were deep brown, almost black, and they were lively and active, looking up at me. "Well, ma'am," I said, "we do have some pantsuits and some jackets for ladies if you'd like me to show you." "Ma'am," she remarked playfully, "do I really look that old to you?" I chuckled nervously, breaking eye contact with her and clearing my throat again. God, I must have seemed like a schoolboy. I then told her not at all, that she didn't look old, but that I just wanted to be respectful. Her smile widened, her long purple fingernails fidgeting with her purse strap. "Well," she said in a soft, heavy voice, "I'm actually here to find a suit for my son. He wants a tuxedo for prom." I furrowed my brow. This was the dead of winter. Proms aren't usually held until June or late May at the earliest. "I know," she said, reading my look. "His school is impossible. They want to hold it early so that the students don't get too distracted from their studies. My son's also too busy playing computer games to go get a suit himself, and too embarrassed to come with me, so here I am. I couldn't help but grin eagerly. Just my luck, I thought. I showed her some of our more popular items. She told me her son's size and measurements, and together we found something she thought he'd like. The whole time, she sided close to me, and I could smell her floral perfume. It was soothing and, I'll admit, I didn't make any attempt to distance myself from her. As I was ringing her up at the cash till, I told her that if anything didn't quite fit, she could bring it back in and we'd happily have it adjusted to fit her son. She gave a low, almost inaudible laughter and told me that I probably didn't have to worry about that. There were no other customers in the store then, and the other cashier was on break, so we continued to chat. She asked me what I did in my spare time for fun, and I hesitated, thinking of the rows of empty liquor bottles in my apartment and the sleeping pills next to the bathtub. Instead of answering her question, I jumped at the opportunity and asked her if she'd like to get a drink later that evening. She said nothing but tilted her head and scanned me with her sexy roaming eyes. "When do you get off work?" she muttered softly. At 7. The words leapt from my mouth. "If that's not too late for you?" "No," she said, her pearly grin flashing at me over supple red lipstick. "That's perfect. I know a bar around this area. I'll be out front to pick you up." "Great," I said. What's your name again?" "Andrea." "Andrea," I repeated, extending my hand. "I'm Andy. Nice to meet you." Naturally." That seemed to put my nagging feeling of déjà vu to rest. I had never known an Andrea, or met any Andreas for that matter, but the name was fitting, and I rolled each syllable over and over across my tongue, waiting for the hours of my shift to wilt away. By 6:30, we were locking up. Jane, the girl working there, was balancing the cash register while I wrote the day's records in the books. As I wrote down the total debits and credits, I could barely hold on to the pencil. I was so jittery. I know how pathetic this must sound, but it had been a while since I had been with a woman in any way. Being older and just divorced, it was hard to build up the confidence to start dating again. At 7 o'clock, it was dark out. Jane walked out and waved goodbye as I locked up the front door. At the curb in front of the sidewalk was a small blue station wagon. Not very fancy, but I wasn't about to complain. I looked through the passenger side window and saw Andrea peering out at me, her hooded eyes meeting mine, that slight smile drawn across her face. I got in and immediately noticed how cold it was. There didn't seem to be any heating at all, and the radio wasn't even on. Strange, I thought, but maybe she lives close by. As she navigated out of the plaza and onto the road, I prattled on about the tuxedo I had sold her, and how most customers said they were really happy with it. She didn't respond and wasn't smiling anymore. I didn't think too deep into it, though. After all, she was driving. It's important to keep concentration. The only thing that struck me as odd was that she had placed her purse on her lap while she was driving. Since I had had to sell my car after the divorce, I was very pleased to not have to ride the bus, so I just eased back into my seat and enjoyed. I think that's the reason that I didn't notice that we had been on the road a long time, despite her telling me this bar was close by. I knew something was up after she had gotten onto a highway interchange. I looked at her very confused. "Did you say this bar was out of town?" I asked. She didn't respond. Her eyes were glued to the road as we cruised up the ramp and onto the interstate. By now, I was getting really nervous. I noticed she took her left hand from the steering wheel and reached inside her purse. "You really don't remember me," she said, her voice just louder than the car engine. I giggled a bit, but I didn't find this funny at all. I don't know," I stammered, looking at her. "You do look familiar, but I know I've never met an Andrea before." I looked down at her lap, into her now open purse, and felt my heart freeze in my chest. Inside, the taped handle held in her delicate fingers was a snubbed nose revolver. I squirmed in my seat as if I was going to fly out from the window, the seatbelt digging into my neck. What the hell are you doing?" I shouted, between panted breaths. The gun was now out and pointed at me. "You probably don't know any Andrea," she said coldly, her voice empty, vacant. "But you might remember Alicia Moretto." Probably from the panic, I felt staring down the barrel of that gun. The name didn't ring any bells. She then looked at me, those bedroom eyes now burning like hot coals. "Open the glove box," she muttered in a staid voice. What? I asked. "Open the glove box!" she screamed. I shuddered from the sharp change in her voice. I did as I was told. Gingerly, I stretched my shaking hand and pushed the lock button. The compartment door fell open, and out spilled what had to be hundreds of pages of paper. They were all lying at my feet. She peered down in a quick glance and instructed me to read the stapled pages printed on red paper. I picked them up and immediately recognized what it was. My post of my stalker story to an internet forum for true horror stories. I then figured out who she was. Alicia Moretto, the mentally disturbed girl who had stalked me at my workplace and at my home years ago when I was in my late teens. I pleaded with her and she just hollered at me to read it. Her eyes back on the road, but the revolver still trained on me. I did as she said. It was all there, my words. How she had come into the coffee shop where I worked. How her hair was constantly tangled and greasy. How her clothes were always in tatters. How she always smelled of BO and Vaseline. It was all there. How she had come in every morning. How she knew my schedule and when my shift ended. How my coworkers had told me that she would sometimes come in on my days off and ask where I was. How one night I had found her waiting for me in my house. I tried to swallow, but I couldn't. I was trembling, and the printed out pages fell from my weak hands involuntarily. She peeked over at me. I could see her from the corner of my eyes, and told me to pick up the next set of pages, the one printed on gray paper. I begged her again to just let me go, and she screamed for me to read it. I picked them up, not recognizing any of the writing on it. Then, I realized that these were comments people had written on my post of the story. Comments like, "What a crazy bitch," or "I would have been so freaked by that cow," or "I'd have still hit it, LOL. Tears had started streaming down my face by the time I'd realized what this was. She had found my story, recognized it, and had come for me. "Please," I said to her, choked up having read all the comments and realized her purpose. I didn't know it would upset you this much. I never used your real name." "Do you think that matters?" Her voice cracked. It was like an animal growling at me. All the prior sophistication had sensually gone. I knew that story was about me. about a time in my life I was ashamed of." She trailed off. It sounded as though she began to sob. I looked at her, and her mouth was hung open, as if in a silent scream. Her eyes squinted closed. Yes, she too was crying. After a terrifying moment, she gave a cough, tossed back her hair. It was once again icily composed. I looked closely and could just see smudges of mascara under her eyes. She then told me to reach inside her purse. I, of course, was not about to do that. "I won't shoot you if you do exactly what I say." She said it in a calm but uneven voice. The voice smacked of the psychotic desperation of the girl who had pestered me those years ago. I nodded my head slightly, then quickly turned to glance out the window. It was now very dark, and there were few other cars on the road. Careful not to brush up against the gun, I reached over and put my hand in her purse. Inside, I found what felt like a set of Polaroids. My skin waxed cold, imagining that these were probably photos of me she had taken without my knowledge. I pulled them out and looked at them. They weren't pictures of me at all. The first photograph was of a couple standing outside a wedding chapel, the woman smiling radiantly in a white lace gown, the handsome, mustachioed man next to her wearing a black tuxedo and cummerbund. They were close and holding each other's hands. I flipped through to the next photo to see the same couple kissing with their eyes closed, a sun setting above a glimmering ocean behind them. I flipped through, and in the next photo, I saw the woman lying in a hospital bed, covered by dark green surgical sheets holding a newborn baby. The child was wrapped in a blanket, the husband standing beside them, smiling. I flipped through and saw a photo of the couple with two preteen children, sitting on a beach wearing jean shorts and bright-colored shirts, smiling up into the camera's point of view. I then realized these photos were of her, Alicia. She had a family, or had had a family. But what did this have to do with me? I don't understand, I mumbled. She shot me a look out of the corner of her eye and didn't say anything. I looked out of the window and saw there were no lights on the side of the road. Past the shoulder, there was nothing but tall trees and bleak wilderness. We were now far, far from any major city or town. I thought about reaching in my coat for my phone, but knew that if I did, she might have shot me. Then, I started wondering why she didn't just kill me already, if that was what she intended to do. The minutes felt like hours in that car. The darkness beyond the roadside seemed to stretch for an eternity, like I had woken up in hell. Finally, after God knows how long, she spoke. "It took me 10 years, she said, her voice straining, quavering, like that demented girl I remembered. "It took me 3 years to get over you, and another 7 to forgive myself. I went to counseling and therapy. Eventually, I agreed to take the medication. You see, I suffer from paranoid schizophrenia. It sort of runs in my family, but it didn't appear in me until about 5 months before I met you. My parents had gotten a divorce. Dr. Walton told me that's what likely triggered my breakdown. Then, when I saw you, it was like you were there for me. My psychiatrist says I was using you as a misplaced source of love and security, which I felt had been torn away from me by my parents' divorce. You were always there and always so polite, so I mistook your politeness and charm for love and affection." At that moment, I don't know why, but I didn't feel scared anymore. I just felt gloomy, depressed. We often call people crazy, but when we actually hear the medical terms, it becomes a lot less distant, a lot more real. She continued, "So, for 10 years after you, I avoided people. I didn't see friends. I barely spoke to my parents. And I absolutely never went out on dates. First, because I was still in love with you. And then, because I was so ashamed. Ashamed and afraid I would become that super attached psycho that I had been with you. I wanted so many times to contact you and to apologize, but my counselor and Dr. Walton were adamant that that would be a bad idea. They said it would cause me to relapse. So, for 10 years, I was alone, hating myself. Then I met David. David was a graduate student in university studying physical geography. He had approached me first. We met at a bar, or restaurant, actually. My parents had insisted on taking me out for my birthday, and he'd asked the waiter to put our bill on his tab. She then gave a sorrowful laugh, a tear tumbling down her cheek. He barely had enough money to pay for his beer, and he wanted to pay for a whole family's meal just to speak with me. We started out just as friends, and then with his insistence, we became more than that. I loved him and felt so much better. I finally felt well enough to go back to school and complete my degree. We got married shortly after he graduated. He'd been hired on at a consulting firm, so we were mostly stable. I finally forgave myself and forgot all about you, but I never told him. Never. A year into our marriage, we had Aaron, and 2 years later, Cassandra. We were both so happy. I was happy. I got a job as a typist at a law firm. It wasn't much, but it gave me something to do after the children were old enough to go to school. I liked working there. Everyone was so friendly and helpful. One day, Mark, one of the law firm's support staff members and facilities, was showing me this website he often goes to, mostly to look up funny pictures. He told me about this page that has scary stories and creepy encounters, and I immediately recognized what most of the stories were about. I searched all the posts, and it didn't take me long to find one that was familiar. Too familiar. I knew that it was you who had posted it. She then stopped and let out a heavy sigh, her moist eyes rolling up and looking long at the car roof. It was as though she could not believe she was telling me this. Her voice had stopped sounding like a nervous psychotic, and more like that of a sobbing, distraught woman. The gloom lingered thick inside the car, over both of us. After that, my paranoia and anxiety spiked, she continued. I tried to fight it by upping the dose of my medication, but that didn't work. Pretty soon, I just stopped since they only seemed to make me drowsy. She then gave another humorless little laugh as though she caught herself in a lie. You know, I thought it was because David had seen the post that he left me and why I couldn't even get joint custody of the children, but that's not true. The truth is, seeing your post made me act erratic. I I started throwing fits, fighting with him for no reason, shouting at the children and beating them over things that weren't their fault. I had stopped sleeping at night, believing the next-door neighbors were spying on us and plotting to come in and steal everything. It was because of me that David left, and I acted that way because of your post. I was now staring out the window. I could just make out open fields in the distance with the slightest smattering of bushes. Where the hell has she taken me? I couldn't forgive myself, she said. I know now that I never will. I gulped and asked, how did you find me? She smiled maliciously in my direction, amused by my discomfort. Oh, one of the criminal lawyers at my firm, Mike Corson, has a team of private investigators. I do paperwork for him, so I forged a memo asking one of the PIs to find your whereabouts. It didn't take long. I knew your full name, where you had once worked, and where you grew up. I was, of course, surprised you still lived there after all these years. Her smile was now spiteful and mocking. That and her last comment made me look away, slightly galled. Of course, when Mike found out about it, I was fired. Misappropriation of the firm's resources. It didn't help I was already on thin ice for obvious reasons. The road we had driven on had disintegrated into a rough path of scrappy concrete. It was as though we had gone back in time to when there was nothing but dirt and jungle. I actually started worrying that if we drove any longer, that road would stop, or we'd be stranded in desert. Regardless, she drove on, the car swaying and lurching over the craggy pavement. I looked at the clock on the dash and the green numbers revealed 12:03. We had been driving for hours. Another hour passed with nothing, just silence. I started absorbing what she told me and felt this weight form in the pit of my stomach. I had caused this. I had ruined her life. And for what? A little bit of attention on an online forum? Jesus. The episode hadn't been that much of my life, and, for God's sake, she was schizophrenic. The whole damn thing, now, seemed sleazy and I no longer felt scared. I wasn't frightened at all. I just wanted this to end. By 1:15, she slowed down. We pulled over, parked on a gravel shoulder by a vast empty field, the car sitting perpendicular to the road. When she killed the engine, her headlights died, and it went all black beyond the windshield. My eyes adjusted, and I could just make out the black shape of the field beneath the lighter shade of the starless night sky. We both sat there, not looking at each other, like we had just screwed for money. She didn't move, didn't stir. The revolver still trained on me. I'm sorry, I said. My voice was damp and contrite. I know that what I did was wrong. When I met you, it was at a moment when you were most vulnerable, and it was wrong for me to take advantage, even years later. She didn't look at me. She didn't move. But I knew she heard me. Go ahead, I then said to her. Kill me. I deserve to be hurt. I deserve to die. I don't want to live anymore anyway. Just then, she straightened in her seat, still staring out into the field before us. No, she said huskily. You deserve to feel what I feel every day. I then heard the hammer click backward and watched as she opened her perfect mouth and stuck the barrel inside. I shouted and lunged toward her, but Bang. There was a flash, and I saw spots. My ears were ringing and blocked like I was underwater. After about a minute, my eyes adjusted. Then I started stupidly surprised by the sight of the woman's mutilated face resting next to me in the car. The interior was splattered with her blood. My hand groped endlessly for the door handle, finally finding it, and I fell out onto the pebbled ground from the passenger side. I got on my hands and knees and puked my guts out. After I stood up, I doubled over and dry heaved for several minutes. From there, I walked the shoulder, not thumbing, not trying to get home, just trying to get as far away from Andrea, or Alicia, as I could. Eventually, by daybreak, someone driving a rusted pickup pulled over and asked me if I needed a lift. Still shaken and exhausted, I approached his passenger side window. Once I was a foot away from his truck, I saw his face drain pale. His pupils shrink in the sockets, and in one hyper movement, he grabbed the gear stick, put it into drive, and sped away. I stared at the fleeing vehicle confused, then looked down at my clothes. I was, of course, covered with blood. I took off my jacket and shirt, wiped down my face, then tossed them, continuing the rest of the way in just my undershirt and slacks. About 2 hours later, someone picked me up and drove me as far as the next major city. From there, I took a bus home and called in to work sick. Here's an update. About a week after the incident, 2 police officers came to see me at my home. They asked me about my relationship to the deceased, Alicia Moretto Lipman, and I told them the whole story. They informed me that they had found Google Map printouts of my address and a PI file of my name at the scene. They tried to get me to go downtown with them, but I refused and called a lawyer. My new lawyer, Mr. Michael Corson, who agreed to represent me pro bono, told me there's no chance of a charge of murder being brought against me. The evidence of possible foul play is pretty thin. My story, although incredible, makes enough sense, and the police are happy to write off her death as a suicide, rather than spend endless man-hours and overtime investigating a homicide. Corson recommended me to a better matrimonial lawyer, and I got my alimony reduced and received more time to see my kids. I also entered AA, where I have started to get over my self-destructive thoughts and behavior. Don't get me wrong, I feel horrible about what happened to Alicia, and her last words do stick with me. But I mean, how far does guilt get you? I actually didn't realize how crazy my ex could have possibly been. This was a personal experience that happened over a year ago, and it's been a mystery to me ever since. Any information explaining what possibly could have happened would be greatly appreciated. This is in NSW, Australia. I was at my aunt's holiday house in for the weekend. It was just a regular night. A little bit wet, but everything was normal. So, it was around 11:40 p.m., and my dog was sleeping on my bed. Then, he quickly got up and started barking his head off to go outside. So, I let him. This is unusual behavior for my dog. He runs to the other side of the backyard, which is about 15 meters away from the porch, and then stops barking. He was silent. I turned around for 2 seconds to look at my mom, who had just come out to see what was going on. I turned back around, and my dog was just sitting in front of me on the porch like nothing happened. I don't know how he ran back so fast without me noticing. Anyway, here is the interesting bit. Me and my mom hear this loud buzzing sound. Not like an electric sparking sound. Nothing natural like we've ever heard before. And a bright lime green light came shining directly down, lighting up the whole backyard perfectly. like a precise laser scan. And it happened twice. Shine and buzzing. Pause. Shine and buzzing. Stop. There was a roof over the back porch, so I couldn't look up to see where it had come from. My instant thought was aliens. The whole thing was so bizarre, like nothing I had ever heard of or seen before. It started as a deep buzz to a higher pitched buzz and back to a deep buzz, with a green light as the buzzing was happening, and then the whole thing stopped. Then, my dog slowly crept inside and went back up onto my bed and was whimpering. The light couldn't have been from a power line, because there would have been a shadow casting from the roof of the house, and sparks didn't give off the green light anyway, especially not as bright and neon as to what I saw. Can someone please respond and explain, or tell me if anyone has had any similar experiences to this? My mom always said she never believed in ghosts before this house, but it made a believer of her. After the initial manifestation, it was like the house exploded with activity. It started with phantom footsteps on the stairs, up and down all night long. We got used to this pretty quickly. It just became a part of the house's personality. Then came the voices. After midnight, you could never quite be sure if your ears were deceiving you. When they began, it was like a radio stuck between stations. A lot of garbled sounds with an occasional word coming through. Gradually, over the course of about a month, they became more intelligible. We began hearing full conversations coming from the living room, knowing full well everyone in the house was upstairs. We tried several times to sneak down and catch an apparition or something, but no matter what, by the time we reached the middle step, the voices would stop. A couple of months go by, and we're regularly experiencing phantom steps and voices. Random things going missing and turning up somewhere totally random. Taps and knocks, etc. But have yet to catch another apparition. My mom started a new job, working nights, so she always missed all of the activity and explains away the rest. She couldn't explain the ghostly girl in the basement, but she's sure if she thought about it hard enough, she could come up with something. This part is relayed from her to me. One night, I came home from work early, around midnight, and it sounded like you were all in there in the dark having a party. I was mad that your dad let you stay up so late, so I busted in the front door, ready to chew y'all out, but the living room was empty. All the lights were out, and y'all were all sound asleep upstairs. I just thought I must have been hearing neighbors or something and carried myself upstairs and got in the shower. While I was showering, I heard what I thought was one of you girls going down the stairs, so I hollered and told you to get your ass back in bed. And I heard footsteps run back up the stairs and toward y'all's room. I didn't hear anything else, so I figured whoever it was went to bed and finished my shower. I got out and was drying off when I heard the footsteps coming up the stairs this time. I thought one of y'all had snuck downstairs without me knowing and was trying to sneak back up. I flung the bathroom door open, expecting to catch one of y'all in the act, but no one was there. I just sort of shook it off as the house settling and went to my room. I closed the door like I always do, got dressed, and when I went to crawl into bed, I noticed the door was open. I figured it must have latched wrong and went and closed it again. I got halfway across the room before it creaked open again. I spun around and marched over and slammed it and got into bed. I don't know how it didn't wake your dad up, but he just kept snoring. I have a hard time falling asleep, you know, so I was laying in bed staring at the ceiling when, out of the corner of my eye, I see the door swing open again. Now I'm pissed off because I'm thinking the latch is broken. I get up and turn on the light and go look it over. It seemed to be working just fine, so I closed the door and jerked on it real hard to make sure it stayed, and it did. Now, I was curious and starting to think about y'all's ghost stories, so I sat on the edge of the bed and watched the door. Before long, I noticed the knob turning. I reached over and tried to wake Dad, but he just sort of mumbled and rolled over. The knob kept turning until the latch came free and the door swung open again, and this time, a lady walked in. It was a little old lady, skinny with gray hair, wearing a flowered nightgown. She kind of reminded me of your grandma. I froze for a second. I was too shocked to do anything else. She stood there staring holes through me for a minute before I found my voice to ask who she was. She didn't answer. She just stood there and stared. I freaked the hell out. I started shaking your daddy and hollering, and he sat up like he was in a trance. I looked over to where the woman was standing. "What's the matter?" he asked, yawning. I said, "Do you see her?" He blinked real fast and squinted at her. "Yeah?" He said it so casually. "It's just that lady." I was frantic at this point. "What effing lady?" I squealed. And then, like it really wasn't a big deal, he lay back down and immediately fell back asleep. Then, I noticed she's getting closer. She wasn't walking, though. More like gliding, I guess. And she glided right up to me and then threw me into the closet. It was like I was paralyzed. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe or scream or anything. It got so cold in the room that I could see your dad's breath. The woman then glided back out of the closet and back across the room and out the door, swinging it shut behind her. Once she was gone and the door was closed, I gasped and gulped air like a fish out of water. I was trembling and had never been so terrified in my life. But I tell you what, I know ghosts are real now. Personally, I never experienced this old lady ghost, but I know Mom's fear is palpable when she talks about it. I experienced run-ins with several apparitions in that house. My sisters, too. So often that we named them. There was the no-face lady, the peepers or peekaboo men, Tommy, and Cigar Man. We decided the girl in the basement was named Laura because she looked like Laura Ingalls. My dad was a very spiritual man who taught us to live alongside them in peace. Some of them were scary, yes, but we never experienced anything malevolent at all. Most of the time it was like they were wholly unaware of us. I have more ghost stories to tell, but I think I'll wrap this one up here. And that, dear listeners, is the end of these true scary stories. If you are sleeping, I hope Slumberland is treating you nicely. And if you are listening to this while you're awake, I hope you enjoyed this collection of stories. I'll be reading to you all soon. Have a good day, a good afternoon, or